You're listening to Someday List, a podcast by To Do. Every month, we're sitting down with some of our favorite creatives, founders, and entrepreneurs to talk about what they're doing, how they got there, and what they want to tackle next. I'm your host, Evan Leon, and today I'm talking to Kevin Wong, co-founder of Lunar, the first Asian American hard seltzer brand launched in late 2020 that is making waves and breaking down walls in the beverage industry. Kevin and I talk about building a brand that's an extension of yourself and your community, launching a startup in a crowded category in the middle of a pandemic, and testing the waters of entrepreneurship while you're at your day job. Before we get started, if you're looking for an easy way to get organized, look no further. To Do is a thoughtfully constrained minimalist to-do list app that is as simple as paper, because we believe that simple stays organized. To Do helps you focus on the things you need to get done so you have more time for the things that matter. Start your 30-day free trial at todo.com or download the free mobile app. On to the interview. Kevin, thank you so much for being here. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Evan, thanks for having me.
So this is our first time meeting. I'd love to hear your introduction, and I'm going to ask you for two versions. One, what's the LinkedIn version? Who are you? And tell us a little bit about Lunar. And then I'm going to ask you for the AIM chat version. Like, who are you outside of your work?
Yeah, so I'm Kevin. I'm the co-founder of Lunar. I'm a reformed enterprise software professional turned alcohol beverage professional. I spent my career in finance, then in enterprise software, had a few startups, and then making my way to start Lunar, which is the first Asian American craft hard seltzer made with real fruit from Asia. By night or by weekend, let's say, I watch anime, I play volleyball, and I try to work out, though surprisingly, a lot of these hobbies have fallen by the wayside in the past year and a half since I've embarked on this journey that's called Lunar, but hopefully that return to balance can occur pretty soon.
You started out in investment banking, which is notorious for coming with grueling hours. Is that what ultimately led you to look for other opportunities?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Growing up as the eldest son of two immigrant parents, there was always that expectation to follow the normal career path, a stereotypically successful one. And I went down the route of the finance person. And so at JP Morgan, I only was there for about a year. I actually left after 1 year. And a big part of that was the grueling hours. I think the worst week I clocked 130 something hours. So that was tough. And I think the other part, and back then I was young, and so I had the energy to actually do that. But when I looked at the people above me, the executive directors who were in their 40s, 50s, and still grinding it out, and who never seemed happy, I was like, do I want to be them in 20 years? And the answer was no. And so I was like, well, what am I doing here? I might as well just begin searching for what I want to do instead of just slogging it out here, where the people I would look up to and become weren't the people I wanted to emulate.
Yeah. So when did you really first get the entrepreneurial bug?
That's a good question. So towards the end of my tenure in finance, I actually started a company called Apartment Insider. This was apartment visiting as a service. So Imagine you're moving to a new city and you don't know anyone in New York, let's say, and you need to find an apartment because you're starting a new job. Well, the first alternative is that you fly to New York and you scramble about finding a hotel, getting a broker, and trying to find a place in a high stress, high pressure environment. Or you could use Apartment Insider, which is equivalent to having a friend in the city visit apartments for you, take video recordings, ask the questions you want to ask, and send it back to you. And that was my first foray. And I built that during the off hours during banking. And I ultimately found out that I didn't go all in on myself. I didn't really believe in myself and the idea to go after it fully. And that's kind of why it didn't succeed. So that was a big part of the lesson learned that led me to avoid that this time around with Lunar.
So did it take a while for you to build that confidence back up before you tackled Lunar or thought about it as a viable path forward?
It did. And that's why I left JP Morgan to join a enterprise software startup because I realized there was so much I didn't know. I just didn't have enough life experience. I didn't know what a startup company looked like. I didn't know what to do. And I was like, you know what? If I don't know what to do, I might as well go and learn it and experience it.
Hmm.
under someone who's doing it, and I can just kind of observe. And so that's why I joined Yext. I was employee maybe 100 or so. This was about 8 years ago, and I was there until employee like the 1,600 employee mark.
Wow. So something I found remarkable was that you and your co-founder Sean both had full-time jobs while running Lunar in the early days. Do you think the long hours in investment banking helped prepare you for that?
I think part of it maybe, but I think it's less the banking grind, but more so like the work ethic that I think both of us had just growing up. Both of us come from not very well-to-do families. And so that work ethic has always been instilled in both of us. Actually, we have similar backgrounds. We both grew up in Maryland and then both went to college together. So we had the
Mhm.
same shared background there of just working hard and something you believe in. And it's also easier to work hard on something that you are passionate about, that you care more deeply about. It comes more naturally. And I think that's how we were able to balance work and side work, so to speak.
Yeah. So, how are you organizing your time and keeping from getting overwhelmed when you're juggling a day job and trying to run your own business in the off hours?
I think for both of us have different styles of time management. I think for me, it's very much I am a big to do list person. I have multiple actually. They're
Hmm.
categorized by like personal versus work versus other things, and so I'm a stickler for that. And we also live and die by calendar. From blocking off, time to, for example, time to R&D and time to brew,
Yeah.
or blocking off time to reflect, or blocking out time for personal life. These are all ways that we structure our time, because as an entrepreneur, your most infinite resource, so to speak, is time, right? Like more often than not, you don't have the luxury of just money to spend to solve problems and make them go away. And so you need to solve problems by investing your time. And managing that down to the minute is pretty crucial, although pretty excruciating in the beginning.
That's pretty interesting that you say you block off time for reflecting. Is that for personal reflection or for the business as well?
For both, I think it's
Okay.
always important to look back, and I would say I'm pretty bad at it in terms of like, because you'll get to the point where you have too much stuff on your to do list or too many things that pile
Hmm.
up, you inevitably fall behind, and then you
Hmm.
start prioritizing like, oh well, I can reflect next week, and then so you just reschedule things and move things around, and all of a sudden now you haven't taken time to reflect in like a month, and you're like, oh crap. But I think it's an important part of processing.
Uh-huh.
It's to take a step and say, hey, this is how far we've come, and celebrate those wins.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of reflection right now. What's your unfiltered advice for people who have a day job and might be thinking about starting a business or a side gig or what have you?
I would say stay at your day job. Don't quit your day job too soon.
Okay.
I think the hardest part of entrepreneurship is making that leap, and it's hard to know if you're ready for that leap. It's a
Uh-huh.
really big one, and there are a lot of ways to test the waters to see if you're ready for that leap. Right?
Hmm.
Entrepreneurship may not be for everybody. It's like having a kid and then some. It's draining physically, mentally, emotionally, and you never know what you're getting yourself into fully. One of my mentors has told me, you don't ever know how to start a company until you start a company. You can't just read articles online and all of a sudden read interviews, listen to interviews and be like, oh yeah, I understand how it is to start a company. You don't really know, because with all the highs that you see in media and press and on LinkedIn, there's a ton of lows that you don't see.
Hmm.
The grind of, for us, packing boxes and lugging them via my apartment dolly and bringing that to USPS at like 8 a.m. in the morning every single day, or even on
Hmm.
Saturday. Like you don't see those moments necessarily every day. You might see them once
Yeah.
in a while when we talk about it, but you don't see like the phone calls, talking to your partners, dealing with problems, dealing with fire drills. These never make it out to the world. You don't really see these, and it's because no one necessarily wants to see them. And
Uh-huh.
so there's that interesting thing where there's this shadow verse of how it is to be an entrepreneur that people talk about. Oh yeah, being an entrepreneur is so hard, but what about that is so hard? And you don't
Hmm.
get to see that minutiae until you live it. So I would definitely recommend stay at your day job unless you have that financial cushion, or unless you're otherwise ready to make that leap. And when you make that leap, just know that it's always better with a friend, with a co-founder.
How long did it take for you to get to that point of knowing you were ready for entrepreneurship?
Well, I guess the time period from my first startup until this one was about 8 years, and so I think it took me 8 years to
Okay.
really feel comfortable, or 7 years. I think a lot of the learnings I experienced at Yext, which was my previous job, there were a lot of ways in which I was able to dip my toes into entrepreneurship internally. So, like being an
Hmm.
entrepreneur, from starting new initiatives to building teams to launching a new market. These are like micro moments of entrepreneurship that have some of it, but not all of it. And so it let
Hmm.
me test the waters. And so I kind of knew a little bit better of what it could look like. And with Lunar, so we spent about a year and a half learning how to brew in our
Yeah.
apartments in New York. Our idea came about in early 2019 when my co-founder and I were eating Korean fried chicken, and we realized that, hey, why are we drinking Bud Light when the menu is so authentic and thoughtful? And so a year and a half of brewing later, and a year and a half of researching alcohol laws and this and that, just a lot of prep work. And when we finally launched in October of 2020, we were lucky that we sold out. And we were like, well, this seems like we might be onto something. It seems like we've made something that resonates with a lot of people. And it seems like we should probably try to go at it a little bit more.
Hmm.
Though, in some ways, we were blessed that our hand was forced because starting any CPG business is very capital intensive. We had
Hmm.
put enough of our own money to kind of start, but we weren't able to go all in unless we raised money from friends and family and other people. And so we were kind of forced to do that to even
Yeah.
begin the company. And so after doing so, well, the next question is, well, we have other people's money. It, they probably expect us to work on this full time, work on some other jobs. And so
Yeah.
we were kind of forced into that situation. And we, having worked for so many years, we had some savings that we could rely on to at least go full time and give it a shot. So we were in that position where we were kind of, our hand was forced, so to speak.
Yeah. So at the point where you are going around fundraising, was the Lunar branding and story all there yet, or did that come together in the process while you were fundraising?
I would say that the brand, so Lunar is it's very personal to both myself and my co-founder.
Hmm.
Our tagline is Asian Americana in a can. And on each can, we have a letter that talks about our company mission and what we're trying to do, and
Hmm.
essentially share stories of our heritage with the world. So that always existed. I would say the design, the branding, the positioning, a lot of that probably didn't get finalized, and we're still finalizing it, so to speak. It's an ever
Hmm.
evolving journey, but the core essence of who we are is really myself and my co-founder. It is us, but
Hmm.
personified or into embodied into a drink format. That North Star has never wavered. Rather, the ways that it has manifested via words and via colors and design has changed over time, but really revolving and circling around the same beating heart.
Hmm. So there are a confluence of interesting challenges and opportunities here that make Lunar Story really fascinating, in my opinion. One is the explosion of the seltzer category over the last few years. Two, the increased attention and awareness of AAPI food, culture, heritage, media, etc. And then three, the pandemic. There's a lot to unpack there. So let's start with the hard seltzer boom. This is a product category that has exploded over the last few years. How did you guys land on the idea of doing a seltzer in the first place? And did you ever have any misgivings, either at the beginning or as you've been growing the business, about entering this fast paced, fast growing category?
So when we had the idea for Lunar at that fated Korean fried chicken dinner, the observation we saw was simply that the drink menu lacked options that spoke and resonated with myself, my co-founder, and our community. It wasn't that, hey, hard seltzer, we should do a hard seltzer. It was simply
Mhm.
just that we saw that lack of representation on the drink menu. So when we started learning how to brew, we were actually trying to make beer in the beginning, and we made some really gross tasting beer. So that was quickly ruled out as like, well, we're not very good at this. But in 2019, right when we were doing all this R&D, that was when White Claw had its infamous shortage during the summer, and we saw that as an opportunity both from a market growth perspective and trend perspective, but also having had many White Claws myself, we were like, look, this doesn't really taste like much. And it could be a really good canvas, right, for us to
Yeah.
paint upon. And so that was the thing that we latched onto as perhaps the hard seltzer format is a good one for us to express what we want to express. And so we then pivoted our brewing learnings and experiments to making seltzer. And one thing led to another, and we ended up making a really delicious one that people loved.
What does the R&D process look like to get to that first iteration of the product?
It was a lot of YouTube and Googling and homebrew forums in the beginning. So there's a recipe online. It's called the Apocalypse Brew. Now, imagine you're in the apocalypse and there's zombies outside, and
Uh-huh.
you're like, my door is not going to hold for another few days. I just need a drink. I need a stiff drink. And but you're in apocalypse. How are you going to
Yeah.
find that? The Apocalypse Brew is simply, how do you make alcohol with the least amount of things and ingredients and resources? And the process for that is you take yeast, you feed it sugar, and you let that ferment. And so yeast will then create alcohol. That's actually like the simplified basics of making seltzer. That is like how White Claw is made. That is how our drinks are made. And so that's actually how we started. That was the beginning of our process, was brewing this Apocalypse Brew and then tweaking it to make it taste good. We had purchased a lot of kegs and tanks that we would use at home. And we were pretty scientific about this, where we had lists of every single recipe iteration that we have tried. And we would internally try a bunch of recipes until we found one that we were like, oh, that's pretty good. Let's give it a shot. And then we'll invite our friends over, chefs, just friends from New York, and they would come over and taste test. And in true R&D fashion, we'll then give them a survey and have them rank flavors and then give a score to them, tell us what they liked and didn't like about each one. And we use that data-driven process to land upon the flavors that we then launched with.
So, I mean, I'm not super familiar with the brewing process, but I have friends who home brew. What is the time scale of all that R&D testing?
So brewing seltzer is similar to brewing beer. So it
Okay.
takes about 20 days for each iteration. The fermentation process will take anywhere from 10 to 20 days, depending on the yeast strain you choose. So it's a pretty lengthy cycle. And so we ended up with multiple batches brewing at the same time, just to make sure we can get enough experiments and iterations going. And so our apartments were pretty full with a lot of kegs.
Are you guys still brewing in your apartments for R&D?
We no longer brew in apartments for R&D. We contract brew, so we partner with a local brewery, and with them, we are able to iterate a little bit quicker with them producing larger volumes.
This interview is brought to you by To Do. You're juggling a lot and you don't know where to start. We've all been there. And that's why we made To Do with the core belief that less is more. To Do is the minimalist to-do list app to ease your cognitive burdens. We are the most refreshing task manager in a sea of monster energy drinks. No pings, no feeds, no comments, just you and the things you need to get done in a simple, intuitive interface. Use code SomedayList for 20% off when you subscribe at TEUXDEUX.com. Back to the interview. So you have this really data-driven process for product testing and learning how to make seltzer. How do you go about getting up to speed on an entirely new industry? Something I don't think that you or your co-founder had previous experience in, correct?
Yeah, a lot of the learning, I think, just happens as it comes. The most common thread of the past 2 years has been, I don't know. Um, for example, how do we start selling alcohol? I don't know. And in the beginning, there's a lot of things you simply don't know. And, I think people can say this is, what is it? Unconscious incompetence, where you simply don't know the set of things that exist. You don't even know. You're just going at it blind. And I think at this point, maybe a year and a half down the road, we kind of now know what things we don't know. So that's definitely very helpful. It's a step towards competence. And a lot of this time has been around asking questions and being resourceful and finding out answers. In the beginning, we were trying to figure out, how do brands even start selling alcohol? What stuff do you need to do? And so we actually reverse engineered other alcohol brands. We looked at how they were registered. We searched up their files in state registration. We kind of reverse engineered where the products came from, who are they using as
Okay.
partners, who is selling their products. And we use that as a way to understand the world, just by reverse engineering what other people have done,
Mm-hmm.
having not come from the industry ourselves. And then the last piece of this is finding people that are familiar with the space and bringing them into your orbit, right? Having mentors and supporters that will help you along your journey, that probably have the answers to the questions, instead of having to, go through Google and fill in like research and phone calls for like a week. They probably already know, like, oh yeah, this is how you do it. And a lot of it's also just learning by doing and learning by failing. We've definitely had plenty of mistakes over the past year and a half, and we will continue making those mistakes. Now, the goal is not make the same mistakes, but we definitely have made a lot of mistakes for the first
Yeah.
time. And I think that's when you really can kind of understand, oh, that didn't make any sense, right? Like, oh, we shouldn't have stored our products in that fashion. We should probably not stack our products so high because they're heavy. We should probably add more packaging in our shipping, yada, yada. There's like a million things
Hmm.
that we could talk about forever. But it's about surrounding yourself with people that will help. And it's about being resourceful and finding information. And I think that's a characteristic that's definitely underappreciated, being
Hmm.
resourceful and being able to find out things. I think commonly when you work a typical career, there are resources available to you. Like, oh, you have an IT team to ask questions from. You have teams
Hmm.
that their whole job is to be that expert so that they can help you focus on what you're supposed to do. But when you're starting a company, that doesn't exist. You're off to the races yourself. And so you need to be able to find that information quickly. And I think that's one of the skills that I think we've developed in a big way over the past 2 years.
I really like that philosophy of operating from a stance of not knowing and not necessarily not really being ashamed about it, just being curious and seeking out the answers yourselves. So Lunar has this really unique proposition of premium ingredients and flavors sourced from Asia, and that has been important and central to the brand since the beginning. One, why was that so important? And two, in theory, is there like, I imagine there is, but is there a version of this business that's easier to make and less of a hassle to you logistically? Talk me through your thought process.
Yeah, so with Lunar, our goal is to really accurately portray and share these flavors and stories from my
Hmm.
childhood, from our heritage, right? Lychee, for instance, I spent my summers growing up in Taiwan,
Hmm.
and one of my my core childhood memories is grandma taking me to fruit stalls and buying lychee, and then just that sensation of biting into a lychee in that sweltering tropical heat. That is like
Hmm.
a core memory for me. That's an experience that I think a lot of other people share. Now, if for us with Lunar as a very authentic, as a very unapologetic brand, it's important to us to replicate that as much as we can, right? For those who are familiar with our flavors, for them to try our products and be like, wow, that reminds me of this time when I was a kid. That reminds me
Hmm.
of my summer in Korea. That reminds me of something. And we didn't feel like we could do that if we took liberties on creating the product, right? And for people who
Yeah.
are new to the flavors that we are bringing to the table, we wanted their first experience with lychee, with yuzu, to be very real. It's and this is something we've talked a lot about because at Lunar, we use real fruit juices sourced from Asia. We use really high quality stuff, and we
Hmm.
don't use any chemicals. There's no artificial flavors, and that makes sourcing a challenge. It's definitely difficult to be bringing all these different ingredients over to our facility, and using real fruit juices adds a lot of cost. But when we see people try a drink, people notice a difference. Many other Almost all other hard seltzers use artificial flavors. Hard seltzer
Hmm.
with natural flavors, which are just chemicals. And when you try those products, it's you can tell the
Uh-huh.
difference. Our brand can't support that. Our brand is
Yeah.
about high quality, and our brand is not about that false veneer of flavor. And so, even for us, right, when we think about producing and expanding the company, that's one of the pillars of the company that we can't give up on, which is staying true to ourselves and being high quality.
I've had a chance to try Lunar hard seltzers. They're all delicious. I was really surprised because I thought lychee was going to be my runaway favorite, and it is delicious. But I really enjoyed the yuzu as well. That was probably my favorite. I think this is a good spot to transition to the second factor, and I don't know exactly what to call it. It's not exactly a moment or an arrival because the AAPI community has been here and will be here for a long time. But there is this increased awareness outside of the community of our culture and heritage. How do you juggle or how do you think about that sort of awesome responsibility and this representation being central to your brand while also being very personal to you?
I think the past 3 years have been so monumental for our community, for the Asian American community. from Crazy Rich Asians to Bling Empire to Squid Game to it's so many facets of the Asian American experience that are now rising and that are
Hmm.
now making their way into the mainstream. It's been accelerated by the pandemic, for better or for worse. Things happen for a reason, and now here we are with a very vibrant and thriving movement here. People say this all the time, right? Asian America, any group is not a monolith, and
Hmm.
there are people who are against the term Asian American because they feel that hand waves over all the different nuances and different other cultures that comprise Asian America.
Hmm.
But I think the term is a valuable one because it combines all of us under that singular roof. And there are a lot of similarities across cultures that we share that we should be proud of and that we should be highlighting. Now, I think the most important thing as I think about this brand and Lunar is very personal to myself and my co-founder. It is our facet of Asian America. It is a piece of our lived experience that we're sharing with everyone. And that may not be the same for everyone else. That, we can't purport to say that we represent everyone, but we can represent different facets that we know how to represent. And I think that's
Hmm.
the best way to put it, is that we can be authentic about sharing our experiences as best we can without purporting to speak for others. With me and my co-founder, we're both East Asian. And a big part of what we think about very often when we reflect is we don't have nearly that much South Asian representation on our team, in our branding, in our flavor
Hmm.
profiles. And that's something that we're always striving to rectify. We would like to do something there to really help champion Asian America.
Hmm.
Now, the question is, how do we do that authentically? And so, how do we do this with people that can help us better communicate that story? So there's definitely a heavy burden and responsibility to be a good steward of us as a community. And I think the best way to do it is to be unapologetically ourselves.
You guys do a really great job of that. Lunar is doing some pretty cool stuff to advocate for the AAPI community as well. Can you tell me about some of the initiatives that Lunar is doing?
So at Lunar, we donate 8% of proceeds to AAPI nonprofits and causes every month. We've done this since we started. This is core to who we are as people. Myself and Sean, we've been volunteering at various AAPI nonprofits since like 2016, actually. So the way predates
Wow.
Lunar. And so this is, again, another just representation of Lunar is really just an extension of us. This month, we're really stoked to be supporting the Immigrant History Initiative. They're a nonprofit that essentially creates a curricula about Asian American history for K 12 educators because that's such an overlooked aspect in K 12 education here in the US. So that's who we're supporting this month. We're really stoked about them. They're also based locally here in the NYC metro area. Actually, last year we did something really cool with Welcome to Chinatown, where we helped build an accelerator program with them.
Hmm.
Now, most people will say, what do you mean? Like an accelerator is for like tech companies, right? We actually made an accelerator for mom and pop small businesses in Chinatown, right?
Hmm.
And many of which are started by immigrants, and they're maybe the generation above mine that came here in the 60s and 70s and have been running their restaurant or laundromat for 40 years. But they've never had the chance to adapt to today's era, to use software and digital tools and to kind of modernize their operations to better compete in today's age. And where we stepped in is we helped build a beverage accelerator program for mom and pop restaurants in Chinatown. And so a big part of that is because beverage sales at a restaurant are the profit drivers, right?
Hmm.
You have the best margin on selling a Coke or a Sprite or a beer. And
Hmm.
yet many restaurants don't really push that or don't know how to push that as a profit driver. So we spent time working with multiple restaurants in Chinatown on how to sell beverages, how to craft your beverage selection, how to make it stand out and make it more prominent to help them generate more profits year over year. So, and that was super fun. That was definitely a test of my language abilities, but that was, I think, an endeavor that's very novel. And I think it's one that we should be repeating in all the Chinatowns and then broadly for many immigrant businesses that probably need a chance to compete with more professional and established restaurateurs in this day and age.
Are you speaking Mandarin with these businesses?
I would say it's a very fluent Chinglish.
Do you think it's improved at all through the process? Are your parents more proud of your language ability now than at the beginning?
Debatable. I don't know if it's improved much, but I think effort is what counts here.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. So the last thing I want to touch on is I imagine the pandemic presented a pretty significant hurdle to even launching your business. Now that we're a few years removed from that, how has Lunar's strategy or planning changed?
What's that line? Like we were born in the pandemic, we didn't adopt it. You know, we we started Lunar during the Delta wave, right, in late
Yeah.
2020, and a lot of the ways that we launched and went to market, our decisions were made for us. We wanted to sell to restaurants and be on the menu, but at that time, there's no one's going to restaurants. We
Hmm.
wanted to sell to stores, but the stores were like, "Well, it's winter and our business is suffering, and so we're not taking any new products." So we actually launched online only in the beginning, which is very, very different than how anyone would launch anything normally, which is via stores and restaurants, right? Our approach to market, to working with restaurants and bars, and even bars came way, way, way later. Like we're barely scratching the surface in terms of bars, even now. And so a lot of our focus now with the economy opening back up, with people increasingly going back out, it's been a big shift towards going back to places that we used to frequent pre-pandemic. And kind
Hmm.
of our focus on online has significantly decreased because people aren't buying online anymore. The pendulum has swung back, and we are really eager to be out there drinking and partying and shopping and dining since we've been deprived of that for so long. And
Hmm.
I think that was always inevitable, and it's really it was just a matter of timing and knowing when we can say, hey, look, we're going back out there.
So when you think about the future of Lunar, are you horse blinders on, just thinking about incremental milestones, or do you have grander ambitions for 5 or 10 years down the road, or is it a mixture of both?
I will say that when you're in the trenches, it's definitely hard to peep back out. For us, we definitely, a lot of the things we do are very focused on the very short term, right? We're always thinking about week to week, month to
Hmm.
month, quarter to quarter, just because as a startup company, every month is a very significant percentage of the time you've ever been in business. And so that's the focus generally. So for us this year, right, the focus is continue getting into more stores, continue building more awareness of Lunar. It's the same simple mandates, but just doing that better and faster and more efficiently. But when we take time to reflect, it's revisiting our North Star, reaffirming that that is indeed where we want to go. And for us, I think there's a few variations of that North Star. Our big, hairy, audacious goal, the one that's like 40 years out, is to be a company that when my kids graduate from college, that they want to work for, that we're spoken in the same breath as Apple or Goldman Sachs or Microsoft of today. That they
Hmm.
instead in 20 years they say, I want to work at Lunar. And to have a prominently Asian American company as someone's top choice of the next generation, that is a huge win, I think, for the mission that we were trying to do here. So that is like the future state. Maybe a little bit less far away, maybe 20 years out, I think for us is to become a company similar to Disney, where we
Hmm.
have a whole experience that shares facets of Asian America beyond beverage, but across a lot of different other aspects of life. And that can all live in an experience somewhere. That would be such a cool Mecca like experience for the community and for what our brand represents.
Hmm.
And maybe in 10 years, a little bit more medium term goal is to have Lunar and stores across the US. And the biggest win would be if we were in a small restaurant in the middle of, I don't know, Kansas. And that would be sincerely amazing because that would mean that we've made it to us, that we've really demonstrated what it means to be Asian America, that we've shown that being Asian is American. And that I think is a much more achievable midterm goal that I think we can definitely strive to achieving in 10 years.
I am just sitting here feeling awestruck just listening to your vision of that. That's amazing that you have these 20, 40-year visions of it. And being a Disney, no big sweat. A couple more softball questions before we wrap up. One, I've heard you talk about, I think it's even mentioned on your website, the Korean fried chicken spot where the idea for Lunar was formed. What is this mythical Korean fried chicken spot? What's your recommendation if someone has a late night out and needs Korean fried chicken?
It's embarrassing to admit, but that place is not very good.
Sometimes that's all you need.
For those of you who listening who live in New York City, this was Bar Kogi in Midtown East. I wouldn't particularly say that their fried chicken is the best. I would probably recommend Turntable Mad for Chicken as a better spot, which is in K Town. But that spot, Barkogi, is close to where my co-founder lives. And so that
Okay.
was like the most convenient spot if we were craving Korean fried chicken.
A second question: if you had the chance to share a Lunar hard seltzer with any person, celebrity, historical figure, who would you love to sit down and drink it with?
Wow, I've never been asked that question. I think I would share it with Obama while he was president. I think that all of the things he accomplished during his tenure, and the values that he represents and the ideals he represents, I think it would really jive with him. And I think
Yeah.
he'd be a fan.
All right. And last question, not that you would ever need to, but if you're not ordering a Lunar seltzer, what are you ordering at the bar?
I would drink maku. It's a
Okay.
Korean rice beer. It's makgeolli, but a little bit lighter and with awesome flavor. So you should check them out.
All right. Kevin Wong, thank you so much for being here today. Can you tell us where we can find Lunar?
Yes, if you live in New York, Virginia, or Georgia, you can find Lunar in stores and restaurants, most recently at Trader Joe's. If you don't live in any of those states, fear not. You can buy Lunar online at drinklunar.com, and we ship to most states in the US. And feel free to follow us at Drink Lunar on Instagram, where you'll find out all the latest news about things like limited edition flavors, merch, and beyond.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Someday List. We'll have new episodes for you every month, so make sure to follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, or follow along on social media at To-Do App on Instagram or Asked To Do on Twitter. This podcast is produced by To Do. Our theme music is composed by Evan Laybourne. I want to thank our guest Kevin Wong for coming on again. You can learn more at drinklunar.com. And most importantly, I want to thank you, the listener. We'll catch you next time. That